The mailman knocked harder than usual that Tuesday morning. David Thompson was just finishing his coffee when he heard the urgent rapping at his front door. Through the window he could see the postal worker holding a thick envelope, the kind that usually meant trouble. "Certified mail," the mailman said, handing over the clipboard for David's signature. "Looks important." David signed quickly and took the envelope inside. The return address made his stomach drop. Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. He'd never heard of them before, but something about official mail always made him nervous. His hands shook slightly as he tore open the envelope. The letter was short but devastating. It demanded that he remove all unauthorized structures from community property within 30 days. If he failed to comply, legal action would follow. David read it 3 times before the words really sank in. They were talking about his house, his grandfather's house, the house where 4 generations of his family had lived. He walked outside and stood on the front porch where his great-grandfather used to sit every evening, watching the sunset over the 40 acres of land they'd called home for over a century. But something was different now. Where there used to be rolling fields and scattered trees, he could see rows and rows of identical houses stretching into the distance. When had that happened? David rubbed his eyes and looked again. The subdivision seemed to have appeared overnight, like mushrooms after rain. Brand new houses with perfect lawns and concrete driveways. Street signs he'd never seen before. A fancy entrance gate with stone pillars and the words Riverside Meadows carved in elegant script. His heart started beating faster. This couldn't be right. His family had owned this land since 1923. His great-grandfather had bought it fair and square with money saved from years of hard work. David had the papers to prove it, locked away in the old metal box his grandfather had shown him years ago. He walked to the edge of his property, looking for the familiar markers that had always defined the boundaries. The old iron posts his grandfather had driven into the ground in the 1960s. But they were gone, all of them. Instead, there was fresh dirt and construction equipment parked where his family's ancient oak tree used to stand. That oak tree had been there longer than anyone could remember. His great-grandfather used to tell stories about sitting under its shade during the hottest summer days. His grandfather had carved his initials in the bark when he was young. David's own father had built a tire swing on one of its massive branches, and now it was gone, replaced by a pile of wood chips and a fire hydrant. "This can't be happening," David whispered to himself. He jogged back to the house and grabbed his cell phone, dialing his cousin Raymond, who lived 2 counties over. Raymond had always been the family historian, keeping track of all the old documents and stories. "Ray, something crazy is happening here," David said when his cousin picked up. "I got this letter saying I'm trespassing on HOA property. They built a whole neighborhood around my house." There was silence on the other end for a moment. "What do you mean they built around your house?" "I mean there are houses everywhere. Brand new ones. And they're saying our land belongs to some homeowners association." Raymond's voice got serious. "David, you need to get those papers. The ones Grandpa showed us. Get them right now and don't let them out of your sight." David went straight to his grandfather's old bedroom, now used for storage. In the closet, behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old photo albums, sat a small metal strongbox that had been there as long as he could remember. His grandfather had shown him where the key was hidden when David was 16 years old. "In case something ever happens to this family's land," his grandfather had said solemnly, "you make sure you know where these papers are." David found the key taped under the bottom drawer of the old dresser, exactly where it had always been. His hands trembled as he opened the box. Inside were yellowed documents, some so old the ink had faded to brown. The deed from 1923, signed by his great-grandfather and the man who'd sold him the land, survey maps from different decades, tax receipts going back generations, letters from lawyers, and something else he'd never noticed before, a thick folder marked trust documents. He spread everything out on the kitchen table and started reading. The original deed was clear. His great-grandfather had purchased 40 acres of prime farmland for $800 in cash. The seller was a local landowner who'd needed money quickly during hard economic times. Everything looked legitimate and legal. But as David studied the papers more carefully, he realized his great-grandfather had been incredibly thorough. There were multiple copies of every document, all notarized and witnessed. Survey maps showing exact property boundaries, even photographs of the land markers being installed. His great-grandfather might not have had much formal education, but he understood the importance of protecting what was his. The phone rang, startling David from his research. It was an unknown number, but he answered anyway. "Mr. Thompson, this is Patricia Williams from the Riverside Meadows HOA board. We sent you a notice about the unauthorized structures on community property." David's grip tightened on the phone. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake. This is my family's land. We've owned it for over 100 years. There was a condescending laugh on the other end. "Mr. Thompson, I understand this might be confusing, but our community purchased this land legally 3 years ago. Your residence is in violation of our community standards and local zoning laws." "But I have the deed," David said, his voice rising. "My great-grandfather bought this land in 1923. Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down. Whatever paperwork you think you have, it doesn't change the fact that you're currently occupying private property belonging to our homeowners association. We've been more than patient, but our residents are concerned about property values." David looked out his window at the fancy houses surrounding his modest family home. He could see people in their driveways, some of them pointing toward his house and talking to each other. A few were taking pictures with their phones. "What exactly are you saying?" David asked. "I'm saying you have 28 days left to remove your structures and vacate the property. If you need assistance with relocation, our community management company might be able to provide some resources." The line went dead. David stared at his phone in disbelief. They wanted him to demolish his family's home and leave the land his great-grandfather had worked so hard to buy. He called Raymond back immediately. "They want me gone in 28 days, David said. "They're treating me like some kind of squatter." "Don't you dare move," Raymond said firmly. "Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and definitely don't tear down that house. We need to get a lawyer involved." As the sun set that evening, David sat on his front porch just like his great-grandfather used to do. But instead of looking out over peaceful farmland, he was surrounded by a subdivision full of strangers who apparently believed he was trespassing on their property. The irony wasn't lost on him. His great-grandfather had spent his whole life working to build something permanent for his family, and now David might be the generation that lost it all. But as he sat there in the growing darkness, David remembered something his grandfather used to say. "Your great-grandfather was the smartest man I ever knew. He always said that smart folks plan for problems they hope never come." Maybe, just maybe, his great-grandfather had planned for this too. David couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he kept thinking about his great-grandfather and the stories his family had passed down through the generations. Stories that suddenly seemed much more important than they ever had before. The next morning, he called in sick to work and drove straight to Raymond's house. His cousin was already waiting on the front porch with a cardboard box full of old photo albums and documents. "I've been up all night thinking about this," Raymond said as David climbed the porch steps. "There's stuff about Great-Grandpa Samuel that we need to remember, stuff that might help you now." They spread everything out on Raymond's dining room table: old photographs, family stories written down by various relatives over the years, and documents that David had never seen before. Raymond had been collecting family history for decades, interviewing elderly relatives before they passed away, and tracking down records at courthouses and libraries. "Look at this," Raymond said, pulling out a faded photograph. It showed a tall, serious-looking man standing in front of a simple wooden house. "That's Great-Grandpa Samuel in 1925, 2 years after he bought the land." David studied the photograph. Samuel looked proud but wary, like a man who knew he had to protect what was his. Behind him, David could see the famous oak tree. Much smaller then, but already impressive. "Tell me everything you know about how he got that land," David said. Raymond opened one of his notebooks, filled with handwritten notes from interviews he'd conducted with older family members over the years. "Okay, so Samuel was born into slavery in 1858. After the Civil War, he stayed on as a sharecropper for the same family that had owned him. But he was smart, David, really smart. How smart? Smart enough to save every penny he could for over 30 years. He worked that land from sunup to sundown, raised cotton and corn, and lived on almost nothing so he could put money aside. By 1923, he had saved $800 in gold coins." David whistled low. $800 was serious money in 1923. "But here's the thing," Raymond continued, flipping through his notes. "Samuel knew that being a black landowner in 1923 was dangerous. Real dangerous. There were groups that didn't want black folks owning property, especially good property like that 40 acres. Raymond pulled out another document, this one a handwritten letter from Samuel to his son. The ink was faded, but the words were still readable. "Listen to this," Raymond said and began reading aloud. "My dear son James, I write this so you will know what I have done to protect our family's future. The land is ours by law, but law alone will not keep it safe. I have taken steps to make sure that even if something happens to the papers, even if someone tries to steal what is ours, the truth will come out someday." David felt chills run down his spine. "What kind of steps?" Raymond smiled grimly. "That's where it gets interesting. I interviewed Aunt Ruth before she died, and she told me stories her father had told her. Samuel didn't trust banks, and he sure didn't trust keeping all his important papers in one place. So what did he do? He made copies of everything. Multiple copies. And he hid them all over the property." Raymond pulled out a hand-drawn map that looked like it had been sketched decades ago. According to Aunt Ruth, Samuel buried the original deed under the oak tree in a waterproof metal box. But he also hid copies in the walls of the house, under rocks around the property, and even inside old fence posts. David stared at the map. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. But that's not even the best part." Raymond reached for another folder. Samuel might not have been able to read and write well, but he was nobody's fool. He knew he needed legal protection, too. "What do you mean?" "I found records showing that Samuel traveled all the way to the city in 1924, a year after he bought the land. He met with a black lawyer named Frederick Hayes who specialized in property law. Hayes was one of the first black attorneys in the state, and he understood exactly what Samuel was up against." Raymond pulled out a yellowed legal document. They created a trust, a legal trust that would protect the land for Samuel's descendants. But get this, Hayes suggested something really clever. If anyone ever tried to steal the land or sell it without proper notice to the family, the trust would automatically kick in with penalties. "What kind of penalties?" "I'm not sure about all the details, but Aunt Ruth said Samuel and Hayes were planning for a day when the family might have to fight for their land. They built in protections that would make it very expensive for anyone to steal it." David felt a surge of hope. "Do you think those protections still exist?" "Only one way to find out," Raymond said. "We need to find Frederick Hayes's law firm, or whoever took over his practice when he died. And we need to search that property for Samuel's hidden documents." They spent the rest of the morning going through family stories and documents. David learned things about his great-grandfather that he'd never known. Samuel had been active in his church and community, helping other black families navigate the complex legal system. He'd also been incredibly disciplined about maintaining his property, conducting surveys every few years to make sure the boundaries were clearly marked. "Look at this," Raymond said, showing David a photograph from the 1940s. It showed Samuel's son James, David's grandfather, standing next to survey markers with a white man in a suit. Grandpa James continued Samuel's tradition. Every decade or so, he'd hire a surveyor to come out and confirm the property boundaries. "I remember him doing that when I was a kid," David said. "I always wondered why he was so obsessed with those metal markers, because he understood what his father had taught him. The only way to keep land is to know exactly where it starts and stops, and to have papers proving it's yours." Raymond showed David more photographs from different decades. The 1950s, when James had hired lawyers to fight a highway department that wanted to take part of the land. The 1960s, when he'd updated all the surveys and property records. The 1970s, when he'd successfully fought off another attempt by developers to buy the land. "Wait," David said, studying a photograph from the 1970s. "Is that the same company?" "Meridian Development." Raymond looked at the photo more closely. It showed James standing in front of a sign that read, "Future Home of Meridian Estates." But the sign had been crossed out with red paint. "I'll be damned," Raymond said. "They've been trying to get that land for 50 years. As the afternoon wore on, David began to understand that his family's land wasn't just valuable, it was strategically important. It sat right in the path of the county's growth, perfect for development. Over the decades, various companies and government agencies had tried different approaches to acquire it. Offers to buy, attempts to claim it for public use, even efforts to have it condemned as unsuitable for habitation. But Samuel and his descendants had fought off every challenge, always armed with their documents and their knowledge of exactly what they owned. "David," Raymond said as they packed up the documents, "your great-grandfather was playing a long game. He knew that someday someone would try to take this land, and he made sure that when that day came, his family would be ready to fight back. But they've already built houses on it, David said. What if we're too late? Raymond smiled and pulled out one more document, this one newer than the others. Remember what I said about Samuel being smart? Well, I did some research yesterday after you called. That trust agreement with Frederick Hayes's law firm? It's still active. I found the law firm that took over Hayes's practice when he retired. They're still in business and according to their records, the trust has some very specific clauses about what happens if anyone builds on the land without permission from the legal owners. David felt his heart racing. What kind of clauses? The kind that might just save your family's land, Raymond said. But first we need to find those documents Samuel hid. All of them. Because something tells me we're going to need every piece of evidence we can get. As David drove home that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt since receiving that letter from the HOA. Hope. His great-grandfather had been gone for decades, but his planning and foresight might still be protecting his family's future. The question now was whether David could find and use the tools Samuel had left behind. The oak tree was gone, but maybe Samuel's real legacy was still buried somewhere on that 40 acres, waiting to be discovered. David was digging in his backyard when the first police car pulled up. He'd been out there since sunrise, searching for the metal box Raymond thought might be buried near where the old oak tree used to stand. His hands were dirty and his back ached, but he was determined to find whatever his great-grandfather had hidden. Sir, we've had reports of someone digging without permits, the officer said as he approached. Do you have permission to be excavating on this property? David straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. Officer, this is my property. I'm looking for some family documents. The policeman looked around at the pristine subdivision surrounding David's modest house. According to our records, this address belongs to the Riverside Meadows community. Do you have documentation showing you live here? I've lived here my whole life, David said, frustration creeping into his voice. My family has owned this land for 100 years. The officer was polite but firm. Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and proof of residence. We've had several complaints from homeowners about unauthorized activity. David went inside and returned with his driver's license, his grandfather's deed, and some of the other documents from the metal box. The officer examined them carefully, then made a phone call to dispatch. After several minutes, he handed the papers back. Mr. Thompson, there seems to be some confusion about the property ownership here. I'm not qualified to sort out legal disputes, but I'd strongly suggest you contact an attorney before doing any more digging. After the police left, David called Raymond immediately. They're trying to intimidate you, Raymond said. But more importantly, we need to figure out how they managed to build all those houses on your land without you knowing about it. That afternoon, Raymond arrived with a laptop and a stack of legal documents he'd printed from various government websites. I've been doing research, he said, setting up on David's kitchen table. And what I found is going to make you angry. Raymond opened his laptop and pulled up the county's property tax website. Look at this, he said, typing in David's address. According to the county records, your property was sold for unpaid taxes in 2019. David leaned over Raymond's shoulder to read the screen. That's impossible. I pay my taxes every year. I have receipts. Show me, Raymond said. David went to his filing cabinet and pulled out a folder of tax receipts. Every year since he'd inherited the house from his father, he'd received a tax bill and paid it on time. He had proof of payment going back 15 years. Raymond compared the receipts to the information on the county website. David, look at this carefully. The tax bills you've been paying are for a different property number than what shows up in their current system. What do you mean, different property number? Every piece of land has a unique identification number for tax purposes. The numbers on your receipts don't match the numbers the county is using now for this address. Raymond pointed to the screen. According to this, your family's 40 acres were remapped in 1998 and given a new property identification number. David felt his stomach drop. But nobody told us about any remapping. That's the problem, Raymond said grimly. When they changed the property numbers, they started sending tax bills to a different address. An address where your family hadn't lived for decades. Raymond pulled up more records on his laptop. Look at this. Starting in 2016, the county claims they sent tax bills to an address on Elm Street across town. When nobody paid those bills for 3 years, they put the property up for tax sale. But we never lived on Elm Street, David said. I know, but somehow that's the address the county had in their system for the new property number they assigned to your land. Raymond kept digging through online records. Here's where it gets really interesting. The tax sale was held in November 2019. The property was sold to something called Meridian Development LLC for $12,000. $12,000? For 40 acres? That's how tax sales work. The county just wants to recover the unpaid taxes, which were about $3,000. Meridian got your family's land for a fraction of what it was worth. David sat down heavily in his chair. So some company bought my land for $12,000 because of unpaid taxes that we never knew we owed? It gets worse, Raymond said, continuing to search through records. 3 months after Meridian bought your land from the county, they sold it to Riverside Meadows LLC for $8.9 million. David's mouth fell open. $8.9 million? And then Riverside Meadows immediately began construction on the subdivision. They built 156 houses and sold them for between $300,000 and $600,000 each. Raymond pulled up more documents. I found the legal notices for the tax sale. They were published in something called the Legal Herald, which is apparently a weekly newspaper that specializes in legal notices. Ever heard of it? David shook his head. Never. Neither had I called them this morning. They print about 500 copies each week, and most of their circulation goes to lawyers and government offices. Regular people don't read it, so they publish the notice that my land was being sold for taxes in a newspaper that nobody reads? That's exactly what they did. And technically that satisfies the legal requirement for public notice. David felt sick. How is that legal? Because the law only requires that the notice be published. It doesn't require that the property owner actually see the notice. Raymond kept searching through online records. David, I think this was all planned. Look at this timeline. In 1998, the county remapped your property and assigned it a new identification number. Somehow your family's contact information got lost in that process. For 18 years, you kept paying taxes on the old property number, which the county apparently accepted without telling you it was wrong. But why would they do that? Because as long as someone was paying taxes on the land, there was no reason for anyone to notice the discrepancy. It wasn't until someone wanted to buy the land that they suddenly discovered the unpaid taxes on the new property number. Raymond showed David more records. Look at this. In 2015, a year before the tax bills started going to the wrong address, Meridian Development applied for permits to build a large residential subdivision somewhere in this area. They didn't specify exactly where, but they were clearly planning something big. David studied the documents. You think they knew about the property number mix-up? I think someone did their homework and realized that your family's land was vulnerable because of the remapping confusion. And I think they found a way to exploit that confusion. Raymond pulled up the county's property website again. Here's something else interesting. I looked up the county employee who processed the property remapping in 1998. A guy named Richard Stevens. Guess where he works now? Where? He's the head of planning and development for Meridian Development Company. David stared at his cousin. The same company that bought my land for $12,000? The same company. Stevens worked for the county for 20 years. Then suddenly left in 2017 to join Meridian. 2 years later, Meridian bought your family's land. David walked to his window and looked out at the subdivision. Children were playing in identical front yards. Families were grilling dinner on matching patios. These people had spent their life savings to buy homes, and they had no idea those homes were built on stolen land. Raymond, what am I supposed to do? Even if we can prove this was all a setup, those families didn't do anything wrong. They bought houses in good faith. That's not your problem to solve, Raymond said firmly. Your problem is getting your family's land back. Those homeowners can sue Meridian and Riverside Meadows if they want their money back. David's phone rang. It was an unknown number, but he answered anyway. Mr. Thompson, this is Kevin Morrison from Meridian Development. I understand you've been asking questions about the Riverside Meadows property. David's grip tightened on the phone. Yes, I have questions. Like why you built houses on my family's land? Morrison's voice was smooth and professional. Mr. Thompson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We purchased that property legally through a county tax sale. We have all the proper documentation. Documentation based on a property remapping that my family was never told about, David said. There was a pause. Sir, property remapping is a routine administrative function. Property owners are responsible for keeping their contact information updated with the county. But we never moved, David said. We've lived at the same address for 100 years. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to be honest with you. This kind of confusion happens sometimes when old properties get modernized in our county database. I'd like to help you resolve this situation. How? We're prepared to offer you a settlement. $200,000 to resolve any claims you might have, and we'll help you relocate to a comparable property. David looked around his family's kitchen, at the walls his grandfather had painted, at the windows his great-grandfather had installed. This isn't about money, Mr. Morrison, this is about my family's land. I understand your emotional attachment, Morrison said, but the reality is that we've invested over $15 million developing this community. We have 156 families living here now. The practical solution is compensation, not trying to reverse 3 years of development. I'll call you back, David said, and hung up. Raymond had been listening to the conversation. $200,000 for land they sold for $8.9 million? They must be worried, David said. Otherwise, why call me at all? Because they know something we don't know yet, Raymond said. And tomorrow, we're going to find out what that is. David and Raymond arrived at the law offices of Hayes, Patterson & Associates at 9 o'clock sharp the next morning. The building was old but well-maintained, with brass nameplate that had clearly been there for decades. This was where David's great-grandfather had come nearly a century ago to protect his family's future. The receptionist led them to a conference room where an elderly black man with silver hair was waiting. I'm James Patterson, he said, standing to shake their hands. My grandfather, William Patterson, was Frederick Hayes's law partner back in the 1920s. Thank you for seeing us on such short notice, David said. Patterson smiled. When Raymond called yesterday and mentioned Samuel Williams and the land trust from 1924, I knew we needed to talk immediately. Your great-grandfather was a remarkable man. Patterson opened a thick file folder that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Mr. Hayes and my grandfather kept meticulous records. They understood that their black clients faced unique challenges in protecting their property, so they developed some very creative legal strategies. Raymond said there was some kind of trust, David said. Not just any trust, Patterson said, pulling out documents. Samuel Williams and Frederick Hayes created what we called a defensive trust. It was designed specifically to protect against the kind of land theft that was common in those days. Patterson spread several documents across the table. Your great-grandfather was illiterate, but he was brilliant. He understood that owning land legally was only half the battle. The other half was making sure nobody could steal it through legal trickery. What kind of legal trickery? Raymond asked. Exactly the kind that happened to your family, Patterson said. False tax claims, fraudulent sales, administrative errors that mysteriously benefited white developers. Samuel had seen it happen to other black landowners, and he was determined to prevent it. Patterson pointed to a specific document. This is the original trust agreement. It contained several provisions that were very unusual for 1924, but which Frederick Hayes insisted were necessary. David leaned forward to read the document, but the legal language was difficult to understand. Can you explain it in simple terms? Certainly. First, the trust established Samuel Williams and his descendants as the permanent beneficial owners of the 40 acres, regardless of what might happen to the deed or title. What does that mean? It means that even if someone managed to get possession of the deed through fraud or legal manipulation, the trust would still recognize your family as the true owners. Patterson turned to another page. Second, the trust required that any sale or transfer of the property had to be approved by both the legal owner and the trust. If the property was ever sold without trust approval, the sale would be considered void. Raymond whistled low. So when the county sold the land for taxes, they didn't have trust approval? Exactly. Which means that sale was legally invalid from the moment it happened. But Meridian Development bought the land in good faith, David said. They didn't know about the trust. Patterson smiled grimly. That's where Samuel's real genius shows up. He and Frederick Hayes anticipated that problem. Look at this clause. Patterson pointed to a section of the document that was written in different ink, as if it had been added later. This was added in 1925, a year after the original trust was created. It states that any person or company that builds structures on the land without trust approval becomes liable for restoration costs. Restoration costs? The cost of removing all unauthorized structures and returning the property to its original condition. Plus interest and penalties. David felt his heart racing.
What kind of penalties?
Patterson pulled out a calculator and started working through some numbers. The original penalty was set at 6% interest, compounded annually, calculated from the date of the unauthorized construction. How much would that be now? Patterson's fingers moved across the calculator. Well, construction began in 2020, so we're looking at 5 years of compound interest. The estimated cost to remove 156 houses and restore 40 acres of land would be approximately $4.5 million. Raymond grabbed the calculator and double-checked the math. That's over $6 million with interest and penalties. But that's not even the best part, Patterson said, pulling out another document. Samuel and Frederick Hayes also included a provision for historical interest compensation. What's that? If the property was ever stolen and then developed by someone else, the trust could claim compensation for all the profit that should have belonged to the original owners. With compound interest going back to the date of the theft. Patterson pulled out a thick folder of financial documents. I had my accountants run the numbers yesterday after Raymond called. The land was purchased by Samuel for $800 in 1923. If that had been invested at the conservative rate of 6% annual return, compounded over 100 years, David held his breath. That $800 would be worth approximately $2.6 million today. But that's just the historical value. We also have to calculate the current market value of the land, plus all the profits Meridian and Riverside Meadows made from developing it. Patterson spread financial documents across the table. Meridian bought the land for $12,000 and sold it for $8.9 million. Riverside Meadows then sold 156 houses for a total of approximately $60 million. $60 million. David's voice was barely a whisper. According to the trust provisions, your family is entitled to compensation for the full fair market value of the land, plus a percentage of all profits derived from its unauthorized development. Raymond was studying the documents carefully. How much are we talking about total? Patterson consulted his notes. Conservative estimate? $15 to $20 million, but it could be higher depending on how the court calculates damages. David sat back in his chair, stunned. I just wanted my family's land back. You may get much more than that, Patterson said. But here's the really interesting part. Frederick Hayes included one more provision that I've never seen in any other property trust. What's that? Patterson pulled out a document that looked different from the others. It was written on heavier paper and sealed with red wax. This is what Hayes called the Justice Clause. It was Samuel's idea, and it shows just how far ahead he was thinking. What does it say? It says that if the land is ever stolen through government corruption or conspiracy, the trust can demand a federal investigation and prosecution of everyone involved. David and Raymond exchanged glances. Government corruption? The suspicious property remapping, the misdirected tax bills, the county employee who left to work for the development company. If we can prove this was all coordinated, everyone involved could face federal charges. Patterson stood up and walked to his window, which overlooked the old downtown area where Frederick Hayes had practiced law a century ago. Your great-grandfather understood something that a lot of people didn't realize in 1924. He knew that the law could be a powerful weapon, but only if you planned ahead and documented everything carefully. So what happens now? David asked. Patterson turned back to face them. Now we spring the trap that Samuel Williams set 100 years ago. We file a federal lawsuit against Meridian Development, Riverside Meadows, and the county. We demand restoration of the property to your family, plus full compensation for damages. What about the families who bought houses there? They'll have legal claims against Meridian and Riverside Meadows for selling them houses built on stolen land. Most of them will probably get their money back, plus damages. Patterson gathered up the documents. David, your great-grandfather spent years planning for this exact situation. He knew that someday, someone would try to steal his family's land. And he made sure that when that day came, it would be very, very expensive for them. David thought about the phone call from Meridian Development the day before. Their offer of $200,000 suddenly seemed laughable. How long will all this take? David asked. Federal court moves slowly, but we have an extremely strong case. I'd expect a settlement offer within 60 days. A big settlement offer. As they left the law office, David felt like he was walking in a dream. In the space of 3 days, he'd gone from facing eviction to potentially receiving one of the largest land theft settlements in state history. "Raymond," he said as they got into the car, "do you think Great-Grandpa Samuel knew this would happen?" Raymond smiled and pulled out his notebook of family stories. "Listen to this. It's something Aunt Ruth told me that Samuel used to say. I may not live to see justice, but I'm going to make sure my great-grandchildren do." David looked back at the law office where his great-grandfather had planned his family's future a century ago. Samuel Williams had been gone for decades, but his wisdom and foresight were about to deliver justice that he could never have imagined. The trap was set. Now it was time to spring it. The FBI arrived at David's house on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after James Patterson had filed the federal lawsuit. 2 agents in dark suits knocked on his door while unmarked cars positioned themselves throughout the Riverside Meadows subdivision. "Mr. Thompson." "I'm Agent Lisa Chen," the lead investigator said, showing her badge. "We're here about your family's land case. We need to ask you some questions and examine the property." David invited them inside, where Raymond and Patterson were already waiting. They'd been expecting this visit ever since Patterson had triggered the justice clause in Samuel's trust agreement. "Mr. Thompson, we've been investigating your case for the past month," Agent Chen said, setting up a digital recorder on the kitchen table. "What started as a property dispute has uncovered what appears to be a sophisticated land theft operation." "How sophisticated?" Patterson asked. Agent Chen opened a thick folder. "We've identified at least 12 other properties in this county where the same pattern occurred. Property remapping, misdirected tax bills, sales to shell companies controlled by Meridian Development." David felt his stomach turn. 12 other families lost their land? 12 that we've found so far. Most of them were black families who owned rural property that became valuable as the county developed. But your case is special because your great-grandfather left such detailed documentation. Agent Chen pulled out copies of documents David had never seen before. "We executed search warrants on Meridian Development and the county planning office yesterday. We found emails between Richard Stevens and Meridian executives going back to 2015, discussing specific properties they wanted to acquire." "What kind of emails?" Raymond asked. "Stevens would identify properties owned by elderly or deceased landowners, then create administrative errors in the county database. New property numbers, wrong addresses for tax bills, delayed processing of payments, all designed to create opportunities for tax sales." Agent Chen showed them a printed email. "This one is from Stevens to Meridian CEO Kevin Morrison. It says Williams' property looks vulnerable. Family doesn't seem aware of remapping. Recommend initiating tax delinquency process." David clenched his fists. "They targeted my family specifically. Your family and 11 others. But Stevens made a mistake with your property. He didn't know about the trust agreement your great-grandfather created." Patterson leaned forward. "What's the government's position on our case?" "The Department of Justice is treating this as organized fraud and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights. If convicted, Stevens and the Meridian executives could face federal prison time." Agent Chen closed the folder. "Mr. Thompson, we need your permission to search the property for the documents your great-grandfather buried. If we can find them, it will strengthen our case significantly." David looked around his kitchen, thinking about his great-grandfather digging in this same soil a century ago, carefully hiding evidence that would someday prove his family's ownership. "Let's find them." The search took 3 days. FBI agents used ground-penetrating radar to map the entire 40 acres, looking for anything Samuel might have buried. David and Raymond joined the search, using Samuel's hand-drawn map to guide them to the most likely locations. On the 3rd day, they found it. Buried 6 feet down, exactly where the great oak tree had stood, was a metal ammunition box wrapped in oiled canvas. Inside were the original deed, survey maps, photographs of the property from the 1920s, and something nobody expected: a detailed journal Samuel had kept in his careful handwriting. Agent Chen read from the journal while David and Raymond listened in amazement. Samuel had documented every conversation with Frederick Hayes, every decision about hiding documents, every precaution he'd taken to protect his family's future. "Listen to this entry from 1925, Agent Chen said. Today I spoke with Mr. Hayes about what happens if someone tries to steal our land many years from now. He says the law will protect us if we plan carefully. I pray my great-grandchildren will never need these papers, but if they do, I want them to know their great-grandfather fought for them." David wiped tears from his eyes. Samuel hadn't just planned for legal protection. He'd planned for this exact moment, when his descendants would need proof of his love and sacrifice. The journal also contained Samuel's original business plan for the land. He'd bought 40 acres because he dreamed of farming enough land to support multiple generations of his family. He'd wanted his descendants to build houses on the property, start businesses, create a legacy of prosperity. Your great-grandfather's vision was remarkably similar to what Meridian actually built, Agent Chen observed, except he wanted it to benefit his own family, not some development company. 2 weeks later, David was sitting in James Patterson's office when the phone rang with news that changed everything. "That was the U.S. attorney," Patterson said after hanging up. "Meridian Development and Riverside Meadows want to settle. Not just your case, but all 13 families affected by this scheme." "What kind of settlement?" David asked. Patterson consulted his notes. "They're offering complete restoration of property ownership to all affected families, plus compensation for damages. In your case, they're proposing $22 million. David's mind went blank. $22 million? That includes the current market value of the land, restoration costs for removing the subdivision, compound interest penalties, and punitive damages. Plus, they'll relocate all 156 homeowners to comparable properties at no cost to the families." "What about the criminal charges?" "Stevens has agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's providing evidence about similar schemes in other counties across the state." David walked to Patterson's window and looked out at the city where his great-grandfather had once traveled to find legal protection. "What would Samuel want me to do?" Patterson smiled. According to his journal, he had some very specific ideas about that. Patterson pulled out photocopies of Samuel's journal entries. He wrote about his dream of building a community on that land. Not just houses, but schools, businesses, places where Black families could prosper and build wealth. A community? He wanted to create what he called a place where our children can be safe and successful. He even drew sketches of how he imagined it might look someday. David studied Samuel's drawings. They showed houses, gardens, a school, a church, and businesses all built around the great oak tree that would serve as the community's heart. "Patterson, what if we don't take the money?" "What do you mean?" "What if we take back the land and build what Samuel actually wanted? A community that serves the families who've been hurt by these schemes?" Patterson leaned back in his chair. "That's an interesting idea. The settlement could be structured to give you ownership of the land, plus enough money to develop it according to your great-grandfather's vision." Over the following months, David worked with community leaders, urban planners, and the other affected families to create something unprecedented. Instead of taking individual settlements, they pooled their resources to develop a community land trust that would ensure affordable homeownership for generations. The Riverside Meadows subdivision was carefully dismantled, with all materials recycled or donated to affordable housing projects. The 156 families were relocated to better homes with their mortgages paid in full. Most of them supported the project once they learned the truth about how their original neighborhood had been built. On the site where Samuel had once farmed, they built a new community called Williams Grove. It featured affordable homes for young families, senior housing for elderly residents, a community center, a school, and small business spaces. At the center of it all, they planted a new oak tree with a memorial to Samuel Williams and the other families who had lost their land to fraud. David used his settlement money to establish the Samuel Williams Foundation, which helps families across the country recover land stolen through similar schemes. Raymond became the foundation's chief researcher, using the investigative skills he'd developed tracking their family history. The federal investigation ultimately uncovered land theft schemes in 7 states, leading to the recovery of over 300 properties worth more than $2 billion. Richard Stevens was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Kevin Morrison and 2 other Meridian executives received 6-year sentences. But the most satisfying moment came on a warm Saturday in September. Exactly 2 years after David had received that first threatening letter from the HOA. He was sitting under the new oak tree, watching children play in the community garden, when an elderly woman approached him. "Are you David Thompson?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Dorothy Washington. My grandfather lost his farm in this county back in 1962. I heard about what you did, and I wondered if you might help me get it back." David smiled and gestured for her to sit down. "Mrs. Washington, let me tell you about my great-grandfather Samuel and what he taught our family about planning for the future." As the sun set over Williams Grove, David realized that Samuel's vision had finally come true. Not just the dream of a thriving black community, but the deeper dream of justice that would extend far beyond one family's land. Samuel Williams had set a trap for those who would steal from future generations. A century later, that trap had not only protected his own family, but had become a weapon for justice that would help hundreds of other families reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The oak tree was young, but its roots were already growing deep into soil that would never be stolen again.